A lone wolf howled at his mate's grave until he saw her reflection in the river. The howl tore through the mountain silence like a wound opening. It started low, almost subsonic, building in the wolf's chest until it erupted skyward, raw, shattered, a sound that carried the specific frequency of loss that all creatures recognize regardless of species. The gray wolf stood on the ridge above the shallow grave, his head thrown back, his throat vibrating with the effort of pushing his grief into the indifferent sky. Below him, freshly turned earth marked where he'd spent 3 days digging, covering, protecting the body of the silver-white female who'd been his entire world. And in the valley beyond, the river ran cold and clear, its surface catching the late afternoon light in ways that would soon shatter everything he thought he understood about death and memory and the thin membrane between what was and what might still be. Wait before the next revelation happens. If this bond between these creatures has already touched you, tell us where you're watching from. To witness every act of courage, every impossible friendship, and every silent miracle of nature, subscribe and join our circle. The next moment will change everything. Now, back to the wild. Part 1. The Incident and the Proposition. The Rocky Mountains in autumn held a particular quality of light, thin, crystalline, the kind that made every detail impossibly sharp while somehow also making the whole landscape feel dreamlike, suspended between summer's memory and winter's approach. The aspen groves had turned to gold, their leaves trembling in the constant wind that swept down from the peaks. Snow already dusted the higher elevations, a promise of what was coming, a reminder that survival in this terrain required constant vigilance and the kind of partnership that made two creatures stronger than the sum of their individual capabilities. Kaya and Tala had been such a partnership. They'd met 3 years ago during a harsh winter when both their packs had fractured under the pressure of scarce prey and internal disputes. Kaya had been a mid-ranking male, strong but not dominant enough to challenge for alpha status. Tala had been an omega, lowest in her pack's hierarchy, frequently bullied, often the last to eat. When their paths crossed at the boundary of their territories, both had been alone, both had been hungry, and both had recognized in the other the possibility of something different. They'd formed a pair bond with unusual speed, the kind of connection that seemed to bypass the normal courtship rituals and proceed directly to the deep recognition that wolf pairs sometimes achieved. A partnership based not just on reproductive strategy, but on genuine compatibility, on the way they moved together, hunted together, existed in the same space with the easy coordination of two parts of a single organism. Over 3 years, they'd built a life in the remote valley system that cut through the mountains like a geological secret. They'd marked territory, hunted elk and deer, survived avalanches and bitter cold, and the constant pressure from larger packs that occasionally ventured into their range. They'd made it twice, producing litters that hadn't survived, a common tragedy in wolf reproduction, especially for pairs without a full pack structure to support the pups. The losses had been hard, but they'd endured them together, and Kaya had believed they had time, believed that eventually they'd get it right, that someday pups would survive and their small family would grow into something larger. Then the trap had taken all of that away. It wasn't supposed to be there. The territory was protected wilderness, theoretically safe from human interference. But ranchers occasionally ignored boundaries when they believed wolves threatened their livestock, and someone had set snares in the narrow pass where Kaya and Tala often traveled between their winter and summer ranges. Tala had hit it at full speed, chasing a snowshoe hare, her attention focused on prey rather than the ground beneath her feet. The cable had caught her left rear leg and tightened with the brutal efficiency that made such devices effective. Kaya had heard her yelp, had rushed to her side, had spent hours trying to free her, biting the cable, digging around the anchor point, pulling with all his strength until his jaws bled and his muscles trembled with exhaustion. Nothing had worked. The trap was designed to hold creatures much larger than wolves, and his efforts had only drawn the cable tighter around her leg, cutting through fur and skin to reach bone. Shed looked at him with amber eyes that still held their intelligence, their awareness, even as shock began to set in. Shed whined softly, not from pain exactly, but from understanding. They both knew what happened to wolves caught in traps, knew that even if humans came to check their snares, the outcome was rarely favorable for the trapped animal. Kaya had stayed with her through the day and into night, pressing his body against hers for warmth, licking her face and ears in the grooming behaviors that signaled affection and solidarity. He'd left only once to hunt a rabbit and bring her the meat, though she'd barely eaten. Her leg had swollen grotesquely, infection moving fast in the damaged tissue, and by the second day she'd developed a fever that made her pant even in the cold mountain air. On the third day, she'd simply closed her eyes and stopped breathing. The transition had been quiet, undramatic, just a subtle change in the rhythm of her rib cage, a final exhale that didn't lead to another inhale, the sudden absolute stillness that marked the boundary between living tissue and organic matter. Kaya had known immediately, the way pack animals always knew, but had stayed pressed against her body for hours afterward, as if his warmth could somehow call her back, as if proximity alone could reverse the irreversible. When had finally accepted that she was truly gone, had begun the work of burial. Wolf funerary behavior was documented but not well understood. They didn't always bury their dead, but sometimes they did, especially when the deceased was a mate or close pack member. Kaya had used his powerful jaws and front paws to scrape earth from the hillside near where she died, working with single-minded determination to create a depression large enough to hold her body. The ground had been partially frozen, which made the digging harder, but he'd persisted, motivated by instincts too deep to question. Had dragged her body free from the trap, finally managing to twist the anchor post until it came loose from the ground, and positioned her in the shallow grave with her head oriented toward the valley she'd loved, the place where they'd hunted and played and built their brief, bright life together. Then he covered her with earth and stones, working until his paws bled and his muscles screamed, until the mound was high enough that scavengers would think twice before attempting to dig her up. When he'd finished, he climbed to the ridge above the grave and released the first howl. That had been 4 days ago, had barely moved since, had barely eaten, had done nothing but stand on that ridge and howl at intervals that seemed determined by something other than conscious choice. Grief finding its own rhythm, its own expression, in the oldest language wolves possessed. The howls carried for miles across the mountain valleys, bouncing off cliff faces, threading through forest corridors, announcing his loss to any creature with ears to hear. Other wolves in neighboring territories heard him and adjusted their own vocalizations in response, some offering answering howls that sounded like sympathy, others remaining silent out of respect or indifference. Ravens gathered in the surrounding trees, drawn by the sound and the possibility that the grieving wolf might lead them to food. A cougar heard him from 3 miles away and gave the area wide berth, recognizing in those howls a level of emotional extremity that made even apex predators cautious. But no response changed anything. Tala remained buried under stones and earth, and Kaya remained alone on the ridge, locked in a cycle of grief that seemed to have no natural endpoint. On the 5th day, he ran out of water. He'd been eating snow for hydration, but the physical demands of constant howling, combined with his refusal to leave the ridge, had depleted him more than he'd realized. His tongue felt thick and dry, his eyes burned with dehydration, and finally, reluctantly, he descended from his vigil to seek water. The river lay a half-mile below the gravesite, cutting through the valley floor in the serpentine pattern that erosion had carved over millennia. It was one of the last waterways in the region to freeze, fed by springs that emerge from deep underground where geothermal activity kept the water above freezing even in the depths of winter. Kaya and Tala had drunk from it countless times, had hunted along its banks, had played in its shallows during the brief mountain summer when the sun warmed the water enough to make immersion pleasant rather than dangerous. Kaya approached it now with the mechanical movements of a creature going through necessary motions without real engagement. His paws carried him along the familiar trail more from muscle memory than conscious navigation. His head hung low, his tail dragged, his entire posture communicating exhaustion and defeat. He reached the bank and lowered his head to drink, his muzzle breaking the water's surface, his tongue lapping in the automatic rhythm of hydration. The water was shockingly cold, painful against his dehydrated tissues, but he drank anyway, his body's survival instincts overriding his desire to simply lie down and stop fighting. When he'd drunk his fill, he raised his head, and that's when he saw it. Reflected in the water's surface, wavering slightly with the current but unmistakable in its clarity, was Tala. She stood on the opposite bank, her silver-white coat catching the afternoon light exactly as it always had, her posture alert and healthy, showing none of the damage the trap had inflicted. Her amber eyes looked directly at him across the water, and in them he saw the same intelligence, the same warmth that had defined their 3 years together. Kaya's breath caught. His body went rigid with shock, every muscle tensing as his brain tried to process what his eyes were reporting. He looked up from the reflection to the actual opposite bank. Empty. No wolf stood there, just stones and grass and the dense undergrowth that bordered the river. He looked back at the water. Tala's reflection remained, solid and present, as real as anything else the river's surface captured. He barked once, a sharp sound of confusion and desperate hope. The reflection didn't respond, didn't move, just continued to regard him with those familiar amber eyes. Kaya splashed into the river, his rational mind overridden by the overwhelming need to reach her, to confirm or deny what he was seeing. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, the water deeper, and within seconds he was swimming, fighting to maintain his position as the flow tried to push him downstream. He reached the opposite bank and scrambled up, water streaming from his coat, his breath coming in harsh pants. The bank was empty, no scent but the general smell of forest and stone. No tracks but the old marks of deer and smaller prey animals. No Tala. He looked back across the river to where he'd been standing. Nothing unusual in the reflection now, just the far bank, the stones, the grass, his own disturbed tracks where he'd launched himself into the water. He stood there dripping and confused, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what was clearly there. Wolves didn't hallucinate. Their senses were too precise, their survival too dependent on accurate environmental reading for their brains to manufacture false information. Yet had seen her, as clearly as he'd ever seen anything, reflected in water that apparently held nothing but light and landscape. He waded back across, moving more carefully this time, and approached the spot where he'd first seen the reflection. The angle was important, he realized. He'd been standing in a specific position, his head at a specific height relative to the water's surface. He adjusted his stance, lowering his head, shifting fractionally to the left. There, the reflection appeared again. Tala stood on the opposite bank in the exact same posture, the exact same position, as if she'd never moved, as if she'd been waiting patiently for him to return to where he could see her. This time, Kaya didn't bolt. He stood very still and studied the reflection with the intense focus that wolves brought to hunting, to tracking, to any situation that required precise observation. The image was too detailed to be simple light distortion. He could see individual hairs in her coat, could see the slight asymmetry of her ears, could even see the small scar above her right eye where she'd once collided with a branch during a chase. But it was also wrong in subtle ways. She cast no shadow, despite the late afternoon light that should have thrown her silhouette across the ground. Her reflection didn't quite sync with the water's movement. When ripples crossed the surface, her image remained stable rather than fragmenting the way normal reflections did. And most tellingly, when he looked up from the reflection to the actual bank, nothing was there. He lowered his head back to the viewing angle. She remained in the reflection, waiting. A sound escaped him. Not quite a whine, not quite a howl, but something in between. The vocalization of a creature caught between what he knew to be true and what he desperately wanted to believe. The reflected Tala's ears shifted slightly, responding to his sound, or appearing to respond. The movement was so subtle it might have been a trick of the light or the water's current, but Kaya latched onto it with the drowning desperation of the bereaved. She could hear him, or something could hear him, or his grief had finally broken something fundamental in his perception of reality, and he was descending into whatever madness looked like for wolves. He didn't care which. For the first time in 5 days, he felt something other than the crushing weight of loss. Even if it was delusion, even if he was losing his grip on sanity, this moment offered what the previous days had denied, a sense that some part of Tala remained accessible, that the absolute severance of death might have a loophole, a crack through which connection could still flow. He settled into a position that allowed him to maintain the viewing angle comfortably and simply watched her reflection, memorizing anew all the details he'd thought he'd lost forever. The exact pattern of her facial markings, the way her ears were slightly too large for her head, a trait that had made her look perpetually alert and slightly comical. The graceful curve of her neck where it met her shoulders. Time became elastic, meaningless. The sun continued its descent, the light shifting from afternoon gold to evening amber. The temperature dropped, as it always did in the mountains once the sun moved behind the peaks. Kaya should have been cold, wet as he was, but he barely noticed. All his attention focused on the reflection, on this impossible gift of continued presence. As twilight deepened, the reflection began to fade, not all at once, but gradually, as if Tala were slowly backing away into some distance the reflection couldn't bridge. Kaya whined, low and desperate, but the fading continued until finally the water showed only the darkening sky and the first emergence of stars. She was gone again, but she'd been there. Somehow, in some form, she'd been there. And if she could appear once, perhaps she could appear again. Kaya climbed the bank and shook himself, sending water flying in all directions. The sudden return of physical sensation, cold, hunger, exhaustion, hit him like a wave. But underneath it all was something new, purpose. Not the aimless purpose of grief ritual, not the mechanical completion of burial duties, but actual forward-looking intent. He would return tomorrow, would position himself at that exact angle, at that exact time of day, when the light hit the water in whatever precise configuration had allowed the reflection to appear, would wait for her to show herself again. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to understand what this meant, what she was trying to tell him, what the universe was offering through this crack in the normal rules of death and presence. He looked up toward the ridge where her grave lay, its outline barely visible in the gathering dark. Then he looked back at the river, its surface now black and opaque, holding its secrets. "I saw you," he said, the words emerging as a low rumble that carried none of the howl's theatrical grief, but all of its emotional weight. "I don't know how, I don't know why, but I saw you." The river continued its endless flow, indifferent and eternal, carrying snowmelt toward distant oceans, obeying laws that had governed its behavior since before wolves walked the earth. But somewhere in that flow, in that play of light and water and the mysterious geometry of reflection, a door had opened, and Kaya intended to walk through it. Consequences be damned. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Instinct. The pattern established itself over the following days with the rigid precision of ritual. Kaya would maintain his vigil on the ridge through the morning and early afternoon, howling at intervals that seemed to satisfy some internal clock of grief. Then, as the sun began its descent, he would make his way to the river, to that specific spot on the bank where the angle was right, where the light hit the water in whatever mysterious configuration made the impossible possible. And each day, as twilight approached, Tala's reflection would appear. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, as if she were approaching from a great distance, her form solidifying in the water's surface until she stood clear and present on the opposite bank. Always in the same position, always with that same patient, waiting posture. Always meeting his eyes with a gaze that seemed to communicate something just beyond his ability to interpret. Kaya became obsessed with the details. He noted that the reflection appeared most clearly when the sun hung about 15 degrees above the western peaks, when the light was angled but not yet diffused by atmosphere into the full crimson of sunset. He observed that cloud cover affected the clarity. Overcast days produced a fainter image, while clear skies rendered her in almost photographic detail. He discovered that his own position mattered enormously. Shifting even a few inches to either side would cause the reflection to fragment or disappear entirely, replaced by normal mirrored images of sky and landscape. He tried various experiments. Barking to see if she'd respond, she didn't, or at least showed no visible reaction. Howling, which produced that same subtle ear movement had noticed the first day, as if she heard him from a great distance. Attempting to move while maintaining visual contact, which proved impossible. Any motion that shifted his viewing angle made her vanish immediately. Most frustratingly, he could never capture her scent. No matter how carefully he tested the air, no matter which direction the wind blew, the opposite bank carried no trace of her distinctive smell. That combination of sage and clean fur and something uniquely her that had known as intimately as his own scent. The absence of smell should have convinced him the reflection was purely optical, a trick of light and water and his own desperate perception. But wolf brains didn't work that way. If his eyes reported her presence with such clarity, some part of his mind insisted on treating her as real, regardless of what other senses confirmed or denied. On the 8th day of the pattern, something changed. Kaya had taken his usual position, had watched the reflection solidify into Tala's familiar form, and was settling into what had become a comfortable routine of simply existing in her reflected presence. But today, she moved. The movement was subtle, just a shift of weight from one front paw to the other, the kind of small adjustment any standing animal makes to relieve pressure. But it was movement, definite and deliberate, the first dynamic action she'd shown since the reflections began. Kaya went rigid with attention. He vocalized softly, a questioning whine, and watched as her ears swiveled toward him again, more definitely this time, unmistakably responding to his sound. Then she turned her head, breaking eye contact, and looked downstream. Not at anything Kaya could see in the actual landscape. The real opposite bank held only the usual features of stones and vegetation. But in the reflection, her gaze focused on something specific, her posture shifting to the alert stance wolves assumed when they detected prey or threat. She looked back at him, held his eyes for a moment that seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, then began to walk. Her reflected form moved along the reflected bank, heading downstream, her gait smooth and purposeful. Kaya tracked her with his eyes, afraid to move, afraid that motion would shatter whatever fragile mechanism was allowing this to happen. She walked perhaps 20 yards, then stopped and looked back at him again. The message was unmistakable. "Follow me." Kaya scrambled to his feet and ran along his side of the river, trying to keep pace with her reflected movement while maintaining some version of the correct viewing angle. It was impossible. Running disrupted his position completely, and within seconds the reflection fragmented and vanished, leaving only the ordinary mirror of sky and bank. He skidded to a stop, panting, and carefully repositioned himself at the lower viewing angle. After a moment, the reflection reappeared, but Tala was no longer walking. She stood in the new position, waiting, as if she'd known he'd lose visual contact and had simply paused for him to catch up. They continued this way, a stuttering procession downstream. Tala's reflection moving in the water's surface, Kaya racing to keep pace on his bank, stopping to relocate her reflection, then racing again when she resumed walking. It was frustrating and exhausting, and unlike any hunting or tracking behavior in his experience. But Kaya pursued it with absolute commitment, because what else could he do? This was the first real interaction she'd offered, the first suggestion that these reflections might be more than passive observation, and he would follow that thread wherever it led. After perhaps a half-mile of this halting progress, Talus's reflection stopped at a bend in the river where the water pooled deep and slow, where alders overhung the banks and created shadowed pockets that often held trout. She looked at him, then looked down at the water itself, then back at him. The instruction was clear, though Kaya couldn't fathom the reason. She wanted him to look into the water here, at this specific spot. He lowered his head and stared into the pool. The surface was darker here, shadowed by the alders, and for a moment he saw only murky depths and the vague shapes of submerged stones. Then his eyes adjusted and he saw movement. Fish, dozens of them, kokanee salmon, their bodies bright red with spawning colors, packed into the pool in numbers that seemed impossible for the space available. They'd come up from the main river system to spawn in the smaller tributaries, following instincts millions of years old, gathering in these protected pools to complete their reproductive cycle before death claimed them. Easy prey. Abundant protein at a time when Kaya hadn't eaten properly in over a week. He looked back at Talus's reflection. She watched him with those amber eyes, and in them he thought he saw something that might have been encouragement or might have been simple observation. Feed yourself, survive. The basics that predators had to manage before they could afford the luxury of grief. Kaya hadn't hunted since before Talus's death, hadn't wanted to, hadn't felt the absence of food as anything more than background noise compared to the roaring emptiness of loss. But looking at the salmon, feeling his empty stomach contract with sudden awareness of its own needs, he recognized that his body was still alive, even if his heart felt dead, and living bodies required fuel. He waded into the pool, moving slowly to avoid spooking the fish too badly. The salmon scattered somewhat, but couldn't leave the pool entirely. They were trapped by their own biology, by the imperative to spawn in this exact location regardless of danger. Kaya snapped at one, missed, tried again. His hunting reflexes were rusty from disuse, but salmon weren't particularly difficult prey, especially in such concentrated numbers. On his fourth attempt, he caught one. The fish thrashed powerfully in his jaws, its body designed for swimming upstream against current, but helpless against the wolf's bite force. He carried it to the bank and killed it quickly, then began to eat, tearing through the soft belly to reach the rich organs first, the way wolves instinctively did to maximize nutritional intake. The food hit his system like a drug, triggering cascades of relief and pleasure that his body had been missing. He ate 3 more salmon before his shrunken stomach signaled fullness, then carried a 5th up to higher ground and cached it under a pile of leaves and stones for later. When he returned to the viewing spot, Tala's reflection was gone. The light had shifted too far during his hunt, moving past whatever window allowed the reflection to manifest. Kaya felt a spike of panic. Had he broken the pattern by following her instruction? Had this been a test that he'd somehow failed? But the next day, at the appointed time, she reappeared in the original spot, waiting, patient, and when he vocalized greeting, her ears swiveled toward him in that subtle acknowledgement that had become the only form of communication he had left. The pattern continued, but now it included new elements. Every few days, Tala's reflection would lead him somewhere, sometimes to food sources like the salmon pool, sometimes to sheltered areas where he could rest safely from wind and weather, once to a section of riverbank where he discovered fresh cougar tracks and realized he'd been unknowingly sharing territory with a predator large enough to threaten him. It was as if she were still caring for him, still fulfilling the protective and nurturing functions that had been part of their pair bond, except she was doing it from whatever impossible place reflections inhabited, guiding him through a landscape that looked identical to the one she'd walked in life, but that clearly operated under different rules. Kaya began to understand that he was living in 2 worlds simultaneously. The ordinary world of mountains and prey and weather patterns, where Tala was dead and buried on the ridge, and this other world, this reflected realm, where she remained present and active, if only through the limited medium of water and light and precise viewing angles. Both worlds were real. Both made demands on him, and navigating between them was teaching him things about survival and perception and the nature of connection that 3 years with the living Tala had never revealed. On the 15th day, a storm moved through the mountains. It came from the north, one of those early winter systems that announced the season's true arrival with authority. Snow fell heavily, accumulating fast, driven by winds that made the temperature plunge and turned the landscape into a whiteout of limited visibility in dangerous conditions. Kaya took shelter under a rock overhang, a familiar refuge he'd used many times before. He was better fed now, his coat thickening for winter, his body recovering some of the condition he'd lost during the worst of his grief. But storms like this were still dangerous, especially for a solo wolf without pack support. The storm lasted 2 days. When it finally cleared, the landscape had transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep in the valley, deeper in the drifts. The river ran black against the white, steam rising from its surface where the warmer water met the freezing air. The mountains stood in sharp relief against a sky scrubbed clean of clouds, every detail crystalline in the way that only post-storm light could achieve. Kaya made his way to the viewing spot, breaking trail through the deep snow, his breath forming clouds that dissipated instantly in the dry cold. He was anxious. Would the snow affect the reflections? Would the change in the water's appearance, the altered quality of light, break whatever mechanism allowed Tala to appear? He reached the bank and took his position. The viewing angle was different now. The snowpack had raised the ground level, which meant he had to dig down slightly to achieve the correct height relative to the water's surface. He worked carefully, creating a small depression that allowed him to lower his head to the necessary position. And there she was, clear as ever, perhaps even clearer in the sharp post-storm light. Tala's reflection stood on the opposite bank, her silver-white coat nearly invisible against the snow-covered landscape, except for the subtle shadows that defined her form. Relief flooded through Kaya. Whatever force governed these reflections was stronger than weather, more persistent than seasonal change. She remained accessible, remained present, remained somehow his even in death. But today, something was different. Her posture held a new element. Not urgency exactly, but a kind of focused attention that suggested importance beyond the usual guidance. She looked at him, then deliberately turned and looked upstream, back toward the ridge where her body lay buried. Then she began to walk, moving faster than she'd moved before, her reflected form covering ground with obvious purpose. Kaya followed, struggling through the deep snow, his legs punching through the crust with each step, his progress much slower than hers. He lost sight of her repeatedly as he fought the terrain, relocating her reflection only to find she'd moved further, always upstream, always toward the ridge. After an exhausting 20-minute struggle, he reached a point directly below the gravesite. The ridge loomed above, its slopes now smooth with snow, the individual features he knew so well temporarily erased by the storm's white blanket. Kaya looked for Tallis' reflection and found it in a small eddy where the river curved near the ridge's base. She stood very still, her gaze fixed upward, toward the grave. Then, slowly, she began to fade. Not the gradual fading that came with changing light at day's end, but a more deliberate dissolution, as if she were choosing to withdraw, to release her hold on whatever energy allowed her to manifest in the reflected realm. Kaya whined, high and distressed. Not yet. He wasn't ready, might never be ready. But the fading continued until only the faintest outline remained, and in those final seconds before she vanished completely, her reflection turned to look at him one last time. Her eyes held his, and in them Kaya saw not farewell, but invitation, or command, or simply acknowledgement of what he needed to do, what had been avoiding since the reflections began. Climb the ridge. Face the grave, confront the actual death, not just the reflected echo. Then she was gone, and the water showed only the ordinary reflection of snow and sky and the small, alone shape of a gray wolf standing in the shallows. Part 3. The Revelation and the Fracture. The climb to the ridge was harder than Kai remembered. The snow had buried the familiar trail, forcing him to forge a new path through drifts that sometimes reached his chest. The cold had intensified, dropping to temperatures where each breath froze the moisture in his nostrils, where his paws began to lose feeling despite the thick fur between his pads. By the time he reached the crest, he was exhausted, his muscles trembling from exertion, his body temperature dangerously depleted. But he'd made it, and there, exactly where he'd left it 2 weeks ago, was the grave. Snow had covered the mound, softening its outline, making it seem more like a natural feature of the landscape than a deliberate construction. But Kaya knew every stone, every displaced patch of earth. He could have found this spot blind, guided by scent alone, by the molecular traces of his own digging and the subtle chemical signature that even buried bodies released. He approached slowly, each step weighted with the dread of full confrontation. For the past 2 weeks, he'd been living in a comfortable delusion, believing that the reflections meant Tala wasn't truly gone, that death had been overcome or at least temporarily suspended through some loophole in natural law. The grave had been easy to ignore while he had access to her reflected presence. But the reflections had led him here. She had led him here, and that meant facing what he'd been avoiding. Kaya began to dig. It was harder now than when he'd buried her. The earth had settled and partially frozen. The snow added weight and moisture. But he attacked the task with grim determination, scraping away snow, then digging through the stone layer he'd so carefully placed, then excavating the soil beneath. He didn't know why he was doing this. Some part of him hoped desperately that the grave would be empty, that the reflections had been literal truth and should somehow risen and walked away into that reflected realm. Another part knew with absolute certainty that her body would be exactly where he'd left it, that whatever the reflections were, they weren't resurrection, and this excavation would only confirm the finality he'd been denying. It took an hour to reach the depth where he'd placed her, and there she was. The cold had preserved her somewhat, slowing the normal processes of decay. But 2 weeks had still done their work. Her body had stiffened and partially mummified, her coat dulled by dirt and the chemical changes that accompanied death. Scavengers had apparently attempted to dig down and been deterred by the stone layer, but insects had found their way in, and their work showed in small ways that Kaya's mind tried to refuse to process. She was unquestionably dead, unquestionably gone. Whatever animated her reflections, it wasn't the thing that lay here in the frozen earth. Kaya stood at the edge of his excavation and felt something break inside him. The reflections had been a gift, yes, but they'd also been a delay, a way of avoiding this moment when he had to fully accept that Tala existed now only as memory and mysterious light. The creature in the grave bore her form, but it wasn't her, could never be her again, was just matter waiting for the final transition into component elements. He threw his head back and howled, and this time the sound carried layers the earlier howls had lacked. Not just grief, but rage, at the trap, at whoever had said it, at the universe itself for allowing such specific, pointless cruelty. Rage at himself for not being there when it happened, for not somehow preventing or fixing or undoing what had been done. Rage at the reflections for offering hope, for making him believe that death might be negotiable. The howl went on and on, pulling from depths he didn't know he possessed, until his throat was raw and his lungs burned, and he had nothing left to give it. When silence finally returned, he became aware of another presence on the ridge. Not Tala, not a reflection, but another wolf. She stood at the tree line about 50 yards away, her coat a russet brown that stood out against the snow. Young, maybe 2 years old, small for an adult, but with the lean muscularity that suggested excellent hunting fitness. She watched him with the cautious attention of a creature evaluating threat level and opportunity simultaneously. Kaya had been so absorbed in his grief that he'd failed to notice her scent, had missed all the normal warning signs that wolves use to track each other's movements. Now, seeing her, he felt his hackles rise in automatic territorial response. This was his ridge, his territory, his grief, and she had no right to intrude. He snarled, a low warning that left no ambiguity about his desire for her to leave. She didn't move, just continued to watch him with those assessing eyes, her head slightly tilted as if trying to decode what she was witnessing. Kaya took 3 steps toward her, his posture shifting to full threat display. Ears forward, tail raised, body low and ready to charge. The message was universal wolf language: leave, now, or face the consequences. The young female lowered herself slightly, dipping her head in a submissive gesture that acknowledged his dominance while not quite retreating. Then she did something unexpected. She howled. Her voice was higher than his, clearer, carrying a different emotional frequency. Not grief exactly, but loneliness. The sound of a wolf who'd been traveling alone for too long, who'd heard his grief howls from miles away and come to investigate, drawn by the fundamental wolf need for pack connection. It was an answer to his howling, an offer of companionship, a suggestion that his loneliness didn't have to be permanent. Kaya felt the offer like a physical blow. How dare she? How dare this stranger presume to fill the space Tala had left? To suggest through her presence that loss was survivable, that pack bonds could be rebuilt with someone new. He charged her, closing the distance in seconds, all his rage finding a target that could actually receive it. The female yelped and bolted, her smaller size giving her acceleration that kept her just ahead of his snapping jaws. They ran through the snow, Kaya pushing harder than was wise given his exhausted state, the female staying just out of reach, leading him down from the ridge into the tree line below. She dodged between closely spaced pines, using the terrain to her advantage, and Kaya lost sight of her for a moment. He pulled up short, panting, his vision swimming from exertion and oxygen debt. His rational mind began to reassert itself over the rage, pointing out that he'd just wasted critical energy chasing off a wolf who'd offered no actual threat, who might even have been attempting to offer alliance. But his emotional core didn't care about rationality. It only knew that seeing another wolf on the ridge had felt like betrayal of Tala, of their bond, of the sacred space where grief should be allowed to exist without interruption. He limped back to the grave, his body now screaming with fatigue, with cold, with the accumulated damage of 2 weeks spent surviving on minimal food and maximum emotional extremity. The excavation stood open, snow already beginning to drift back into it, nature immediately beginning the work of recovering what he'd uncovered. Kaya looked at Tala's body one final time, committing to memory not what should become, but what should been. The way she'd moved through the world with grace and intelligence, the way she'd looked at him with understanding, the way they'd functioned together as a unified system greater than either individual part. "I'm sorry," he said, the words a low rumble, "for digging you up, for not being ready to let you go, for being angry at reflections that only tried to help me survive." The body offered no response, would never offer response again. But saying the words somehow helped, made the reality more bearable by putting it into language that existed outside his own circular thoughts. He began to refill the grave, working more quickly now, wanting it finished, wanting to restore the barrier between death and the ongoing demands of life. When the last stone was placed, when the mound approximated its original configuration, he stood back and released one final howl, not of grief this time, but of acknowledgement. She was gone. She would remain gone. The reflections were something else, something separate, and he needed to understand them as such, rather than as extensions of her continued existence. The sun was setting, light fading fast as it did in the mountains during winter. Kaya knew he should find shelter, should cache food for the night, should tend to all the basic survival tasks he'd been neglecting. But first, he needed to return to the river. The descent was treacherous in the failing light, the snow hiding obstacles, his exhausted body making mistakes it normally wouldn't. He slipped twice, rolling several yards before catching himself against trees. By the time he reached the viewing spot, full darkness had fallen, and he knew the conditions weren't right for reflections to appear. But he positioned himself anyway, lowering his head to the correct angle, staring at the black water that reflected only stars and the pale light of a rising moon. No Tala, just water and light and the endless cold. Kaya lay down on the bank, too tired to move further, too depleted to care about the risk of sleeping exposed in such temperatures. If he died here, perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps he and Tala would simply become paired deaths, stories the other wolves would tell about the silver female and the gray male who'd loved each other too much to survive separation. Consciousness began to fade, hypothermia doing its seductive work, making the cold almost warm, making the idea of simply stopping seem reasonable and even attractive. Then a sound penetrated his descending awareness. Footsteps, approaching through snow. The scent that accompanied them was familiar. The young, russet female from the ridge. Shed followed him, had tracked him down the mountain, had found him here on the bank in the final stages of shutting down. She stood over him for a moment, her warm breath creating clouds that drifted across his face, and he felt her assessing his condition with whatever calculus wolves use to evaluate pack members' viability. Then she lay down beside him, pressing her body against her, sharing her heat in the ancient pack behavior that had kept wolves alive through countless winters. She was warm, almost painfully so, against his cold, shocked system, and her presence triggered some survival instinct deep in his core that refused to simply surrender to the seductive pull of freezing. Kaya didn't have the energy to protest, didn't have the will to reject this unwanted rescue. He simply accepted her warmth and let it pull him back from whatever edge he'd been approaching. Consciousness faded again, but this time into the natural rhythm of sleep rather than the permanent darkness of death. Part 4. The Return and the Trial. Kaya woke to bright sunshine and the distinctive headache that accompanied mild hypothermia recovery. His body felt bruised and stiff, his joints protesting any movement, but he was alive and warming and surrounded by the scent of another wolf who'd apparently stayed with him through the entire night. The young female lay curled against his back, her breathing the deep, steady rhythm of someone still asleep. In daylight, Kaya could see her more clearly. Younger than had initially assessed, probably not even 2 years old yet. Underweight, her ribs showing through her coat, suggesting she'd been alone for a while, struggling to hunt large prey without pack support. She'd saved his life, simple as that. Without her intervention, he would have frozen on the riverbank, his body becoming just another casualty of the mountain's indifferent brutality. The realization carried complicated emotions. Gratitude, yes, but also resentment at needing rescue, at being vulnerable, at owing survival to a stranger when survival had started to feel like more burden than gift. He stood carefully, trying not to wake her, and moved to the river for water. The morning light hit the surface at all the wrong angles for reflections, too direct, too bright, lacking the precise geometry that twilight provided. He drank deeply, feeling the cold water shock his system back toward full alertness, then turned to study the female who'd appointed herself his unlikely savior. She was awake now, watching him with cautious optimism, her tail doing a small, tentative wag that suggested hope for positive interaction. Kaya felt his automatic hostility from yesterday softening slightly in the face of her obvious goodwill and the undeniable fact of her life-saving intervention. "Why?" he asked, the vocalization a complex rumble that carried layers of questions. "Why follow me? Why help me? Why care about a stranger?" She cocked her head, processing his tone if not his specific meaning, then replied with her own vocalization. A sound that suggested loneliness, opportunity, the simple wolf calculus that pack was better than solo and an available partner was better than continued isolation. Kaya understood. She was what he'd been before Tala, a dispersed wolf seeking pack affiliation, alone not by choice but by circumstance. She'd heard his howls, had investigated, had found a potential packmate, even if that packmate was currently wrapped up in grief and barely functional. Wolves were pragmatic about such things. Resources could be shared, burdens could be distributed. 2 wolves could accomplish what one couldn't. But accepting her presence felt like betrayal. He'd had a mate, still had a mate in some strange reflected sense. Allowing another female into his territory, into his life, would be moving on in ways he wasn't ready to consider. The female seemed to sense his conflict. She approached slowly, her posture submissive, making herself small and non-threatening. When she got close enough, she began to groom his shoulder, licking at his fur in the affiliative behavior that strengthened pack bonds and reduced social tension. Kaya stood rigid, torn between the comfort of physical contact from another wolf and the loyalty to Talus' memory that seemed to demand he reject all substitutes. The female continued her gentle grooming, patient and persistent, asking nothing except that he accept her presence. Finally, Kaya's body betrayed his resistance, leaning slightly into the grooming, accepting the comfort despite his mind's protests. The female's tail wagged harder, encouraged, and she redoubled her efforts, working over his ears and neck with the thorough attention that spoke of genuine care rather than mere social obligation. They stayed like that for several minutes, existing in the simple physical connection that predated language, that bypassed all the complicated questions about loyalty and memory and appropriate timelines for healing. When the female finally stepped back, Kaya felt fractionally less alone than he had in weeks, not healed, not remotely ready to form a new pair bond, but marginally less convinced that continued isolation was his only option. "You need a name," he rumbled, the sound more gentle than his tone had been since Talus' death. The female's ears perked up, reading the softening in his voice as acceptance, or at least tolerance. She vocalized back, a soft chuff that might have been agreement or might have been simple pleasure at his engagement. Kaya studied her, taking in her russet coat, her bright eyes, her too lean frame that nonetheless showed the muscular potential of a capable hunter. "Ember," he decided, "because you brought warmth when everything was cold." Whether she understood the name was debatable. But she responded to his tone, to the act of naming itself, with a play-bow and a yip of obvious joy. It was the first moment of levity Kaya had experienced since Talus' death, and it felt both wonderful and terrible. Permission to feel something other than grief, warring with guilt about that permission. Over the following days, a tentative routine established itself. Kaya continued his pattern of morning vigils on the ridge and twilight visits to the viewing spot. Ember learned to wait patiently during these times, not intruding, but remaining close enough to offer support when he returned. Together, they hunted. Kaya's size and experience combined with Ember's speed and agility allowed them to take down elk calves and deer that either alone would have struggled to catch. The food made a difference. Kaya's body began to recover its full condition. His coat thickened properly for winter. His energy returned, allowing for the kind of extended travel and territorial maintenance that solo life had made difficult. But the reflections became less frequent. Some days, Talus simply didn't appear at the viewing spot, no matter how precisely Kaya positioned himself, no matter how perfect the light conditions seemed. When she did appear, the reflections seemed fainter, less detailed, as if the energy required to manifest was becoming harder to sustain. Kaya tried to understand the pattern but found none. Weather didn't seem to matter. Moon phases showed no correlation. The reflections came and went according to laws he couldn't decode, and their increasing absence created a different kind of grief, the slow, anticipatory loss of preparing for another goodbye. On a crisp morning 3 weeks after Ember's arrival, Kaya was making his usual dawn visit to the grave when he noticed tracks in the fresh snow. Not wolf tracks, human tracks, accompanied by the distinctive tread marks of the kind of boots that hunters wore. His hackles rose immediately. Humans in this territory were rare, but not unknown. Rangers occasionally patrolled, and during hunting season, licensed hunters sometimes ventured into the wilderness. But these tracks led directly to the gravesite, and something about their purposeful path suggested they weren't random wandering. Kaya followed the tracks up the ridge, Ember trailing behind him with her ears flat, picking up on his tension. The tracks led exactly where he'd feared, to the grave itself. The mound had been disturbed. Not excavated completely, but definitely investigated. The top layer of stones had been moved, the snow carefully brushed away, as if someone had been checking what lay beneath. A small orange flag on a wire stake had been planted beside the grave, the kind of marker that wildlife officials use to tag sites for further investigation. Near the marker, something else, a business card, partially buried in snow. Kaya nosed it cautiously, and though he couldn't read the printed text, he could smell the chemical scent of plastic lamination, could see the official-looking seal printed on its surface. Someone knew about Talus burial. Someone had found the grave and marked it for follow-up, and that meant humans would return, would investigate, would likely remove her body for whatever purposes humans remove dead wolves for: disease testing, population monitoring, evidence in the illegal trapping case they might or might not be pursuing. Kaya felt violation wash through him. The grave had been his private memorial, his sacred space, the physical anchor for his grief. Human interference transformed it into something else, a crime scene, a data point, an object of official interest that stripped away its emotional meaning. He began frantically replacing the stones, trying to restore the grave to its undisturbed state, as if perfect reconstruction could somehow undo the intrusion. Ember watched for a moment, then joined him, pushing stones with her nose and paws, lending her effort to the restoration even though she didn't fully understand his urgency. When they'd finished, the grave looked nearly normal again, though the orange flag remained, a bright violation of the natural landscape's color palette. Kaya tried to remove it, biting at the wire stake, but it was anchored too deeply in the frozen ground for his jaws to dislodge. A sound in the distance pulled his attention, voices. Human voices, approaching up the trail. The investigators returning, probably with equipment for proper excavation, ready to claim Tala's body for whatever analysis they deemed necessary. Kaya looked at Ember, a decision crystallizing in his mind. They couldn't stay here, couldn't defend the grave against human determination and legal authority. But they could move, could establish new territory, could carry the memories to a place where human interference was less likely. He touched his nose to the grave one final time, a gesture of farewell that felt more final than anything he'd done before. Then he turned and ran down the ridge, Ember racing beside him, putting distance between themselves and the approaching voices. They ran for miles, moving through territory Kaya knew intimately, heading toward the remote valley systems that carved deeper into the mountain range, where human presence was rare and wolf pairs could exist with minimal outside interference. As twilight approached, they reached a new section of river, narrower here, faster, cutting through a gorge where cliffs rose on either side. Kaya had been here before with Tala, had marked it as potential territory, but never claimed it because their established range had met all their needs. Now, looking at the unfamiliar configuration of water and stone, he wondered if the reflections would even work here. If they were tied to that specific location, that particular viewing spot, or if they represented some broader phenomenon that could manifest anywhere water and light and grief intersected. Only one way to find out. He moved to the bank and lowered his head to the water's surface, adjusting his position, trying to recreate the angle that had proven successful before. The light was right. That perfect twilight window when the sun hung just above the horizon. The water was clear and relatively calm in this protected section of the river. And there, wavering slightly in the current but unmistakable, was Talus's reflection. She stood on the opposite bank as always, her silver-white coat catching the fading light, her amber eyes finding his across the water. But something was different. She looked faded. Less substantial than before, her edges blurring slightly as if she were dissolving into the surrounding landscape. Kaya whined, low and distressed. She was leaving, not just from this reflection, but from the reflected realm entirely. He could see it happening, could feel the connection between them stretching thinner, approaching some breaking point that would sever it completely. Talus's reflection moved, approaching the water's edge, her form becoming even fainter with the movement. She looked at him with such concentrated intensity that Kaya felt it like physical pressure. Then, she did something she'd never done before. She looked at Ember. The young russet wolf had approached the bank behind Kaya, curious about his focused attention on the water. Now, following Talus's reflected gaze, she positioned herself where she could see the reflection too. Kaya didn't know if Ember could see what he saw, if the reflections were visible to other wolves, or somehow private, a gift meant only for him. But Ember's body went very still, her ears pricking forward with intense attention, suggesting she at least saw something. Tala's reflection held Ember's gaze for a long moment, then looked back at Kaya. Her posture shifted, not the patient waiting stance she'd maintained for weeks, but something more active. She took 3 steps backward, away from the water's edge, creating distance. Then she looked at Kaya one final time, and in her eyes he saw what might have been permission, or release, or simply acknowledgement that his life continued, that the living needed the living, and that his loyalty to her memory didn't require him to refuse all future connection. Then she turned and walked away, her reflection dissolving with each step until she vanished completely, leaving only the ordinary mirror of cliff and sky. Kaya stood frozen, staring at the empty water, waiting for her to reappear as she always had before. But minutes passed, then more minutes, and the reflection remained empty. The light shifted past the critical angle, darkness began to fall, and Tala didn't return. She was gone, truly gone this time, in a way that felt more final than even finding her body in the grave. The reflected realm had released her, or she'd released herself, or the energy that had sustained the manifestations had simply exhausted itself. Kaya wanted to howl, wanted to rage, wanted to refuse this new absence. But what emerged instead was something quieter, a low, mournful sound that acknowledged both loss and acceptance, both grief and the beginnings of healing. Ember moved close and pressed against his side, offering her warmth and presence. Not a replacement for Tala, not even a new mate, at least not yet. Just another living creature, choosing to share space and survival with him, offering the possibility of pack and partnership and the continuation of life despite death's interruptions. Kaya leaned into her warmth and let himself accept it, not forgetting, not betraying, simply continuing. Part 5. The Resolution and Renewal. Winter deepened its grip on the mountains with the remorseless progression that characterized the high country. Snow accumulated in layers, each storm adding to the total until the landscape existed in a perpetual state of white, punctuated only by the dark vertical lines of pine trunks and the occasional exposed rock face too steep for snow to cling to. The river froze at its edges, leaving only a narrow channel of open water in the fastest-moving sections where the current was too vigorous for ice to form. Kaya and Ember had claimed the remote valley as their territory, marking its boundaries, learning its features, establishing the kind of intimate knowledge that meant survival in such harsh conditions. They hunted cooperatively with increasing efficiency. Kaya's power and experience, combined with Ember's speed and enthusiasm, yielding success rates that kept them both fed, even when prey was scarce. The relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, without pressure or the expectation that it replicate what Kaya had lost. Ember seemed to understand intuitively that she wasn't replacing anyone, wasn't being asked to fill a specific Tala-shaped absence. She was simply herself, Young, energetic, occasionally frustrating in her inexperience, but also bringing a lightness to the partnership that balanced Kaya's tendency toward brooding intensity. They still visited the river at twilight, though Kaya had stopped lowering his head to search for reflections. The behavior felt somehow disrespectful now, as if continuing to seek Tala's reflected presence would diminish the finality of her departure, would refuse the release she'd seemed to grant in that last manifestation. But he often stood on the bank and simply looked at the water, remembering, honoring the time when reflections had offered connection, grateful for the gift they'd been, even as he accepted they were finished. On a clear night, 2 months after Ember's arrival, when the moon hung full and bright enough to cast shadows, Kaya heard howling from the north. Not the random vocalizations of distant packs, but something more specific, a pattern of calls that suggested organization, coordination, the kind of complex communication that indicated a pack on the move. He and Ember responded with their own howls, announcing their presence, declaring their territorial claim, warning the approaching wolves that this valley was occupied. The response came quickly, not a challenge, but an acknowledgement. The vocal equivalent of "understood, we're passing through, no conflict intended." Over the next hour, the howls moved closer, and Kaya began to recognize individual voices. One in particular struck a chord of deep familiarity, a specific timbre and phrasing pattern that his mind cataloged and cross-referenced against years of stored memory. His mother, the lead female of his birth pack, a wolf he hadn't encountered in nearly 4 years since dispersing to find his own territory. The recognition triggered complicated emotions. Wolves didn't maintain tight family bonds after dispersal the way some species did. The nuclear family unit dissolved once pups reached maturity, and former pack members often treated each other as strangers if they encountered each other later. But the vocal recognition remained, and with it came floods of memory from his earliest life. An hour later, the pack appeared on the ridge above the valley. 7 wolves, a healthy mid-sized pack by regional standards. Kaya could identify his mother even at this distance by her distinctive gait, slightly favoring her left front leg from an old injury. The pack alpha was a large male Kaya didn't recognize, suggesting leadership had changed since he'd left. The 2 groups regarded each other across the distance, each evaluating threat level and intent. Kaya positioned himself in front of Ember in a protective stance, and she moved close to his flank, showing the united front that declared them a bonded pair despite the absence of pups. His mother separated from the pack and approached slowly, alone, her posture carefully neutral. When she was close enough for easier communication, she stopped and vocalized, a complex sound that carried recognition, curiosity, and a question about whether this encounter would be friendly or hostile. Kaya responded with his own vocalization, allowing recognition while maintaining territorial authority. He was no longer the subordinate pup from her pack, but an adult male with his own territory and partner. The distinction needed to be clear. His mother seemed to understand. She dipped her head slightly in acknowledgement, then shifted her attention to Ember with undisguised interest. The young female held her ground, but allowed her ears to tilt back slightly, showing respect for the older wolf's obvious status. What followed was a complex exchange of scent marking, body language, and vocalization, the wolf equivalent of diplomatic negotiation. His mother conveyed that her pack was moving to new territory further east, that they'd depleted the prey in their previous range and needed to relocate. This valley was directly on their route, but they could detour if Kaya insisted, though it would add days to their journey in weather that was already testing their endurance. Kaya considered. His territorial instincts demanded he refuse access, drive them off, maintain exclusive claim to his range. But his memories of pack life, of the security and efficiency that came with larger group cooperation, suggested another possibility. He looked at Ember, reading her body language. She seemed curious rather than threatened, her youth perhaps making her less rigid about territorial exclusivity. Then he looked back at his mother and made a decision that would have been unthinkable months ago. He stepped aside and vocalized permission for the pack to pass through the valley. More than that, permission to stay for a few days if they need it, to hunt cooperatively, to shelter from the worst of the winter in the protected areas Kaya and Ember had identified. His mother's ears pricked forward in surprise. It was an unusually generous offer, suggesting Kaya had either grown remarkably secure in his territorial claim or was operating under motivations beyond simple range defense. Both were true, Kaya realized. The months of grief and reflection had changed him, had loosened his grip on rigid territorial thinking, had taught him that survival sometimes required cooperation across boundaries that wolves typically defended absolutely. Over the next 3 days, an unusual situation developed. The pack camped in the valley, using it as a base for hunting expeditions that brought down 2 elk and a young moose. Kaya and Ember participated in the hunts, their local knowledge of terrain and prey patterns proving valuable. In exchange, the pack shared kills generously, allowing the pair to eat first in acknowledgement of their territorial status. It wasn't formal pack membership. Kaya and Ember maintained their separate bond, their own den site, their clear identity as a mated pair. But it was cooperation, temporary alliance, the kind of flexible social structure that wolves could employ when circumstances demanded. On the 3rd evening, Kaya found himself sitting with his mother on a ridge overlooking the valley where the rest of the pack was settling in for the night. They'd groomed each other, a behavior he hadn't engaged in since leaving her pack years ago, and now sat in comfortable silence watching the moon rise over the eastern peaks. "You've changed," she rumbled, the vocalization carrying layers of observation and perhaps approval. Kaya didn't ask how she knew. Mothers knew. Yes. Lost your mate? It wasn't a question. The scent markers in the territory told the story. A pair had lived here, but only one scent was fresh and active. The other was old, fading, associated only with the grave site on the distant ridge that Kaya still visited occasionally. Yes. But you're surviving, building new partnerships. She looked toward where Ember was playing with 2 younger members of the pack, her energy and enthusiasm obvious even in the gathering dark. Trying to. His mother leaned against him slightly, a gesture of affection and solidarity. The young female who saved your life, Ember, you call her, she's good for you. Different from what you had before, but that's appropriate. Second partnerships should be different. They're not replacements, but new beginnings. Kaya felt the wisdom in her words, felt them settling into places where guilt and loyalty had been fighting with practical reality. I still see her sometimes, my first mate, in the water. Reflections. He hadn't meant to say it, hadn't told anyone about the reflections, not even Ember. But his mother's presence had unlocked something, made confession feel possible. She didn't react with skepticism or concern, just nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. The dead visit when they need them to, or when we need them to. Water's a good medium for such things, clear but constantly moving, like memory. They sat in silence for a while, and Kaya realized she wasn't going to ask for details, wasn't going to question his sanity or his interpretation. She simply accepted that she'd had experiences beyond normal perception, and that those experiences had shaped him. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Your pack. Will you stay in this territory?" "No. We move on tomorrow. Our path takes us east to lower elevations where prey is more abundant." She paused. "But we might return this way in spring. The valley would make good rendezvous territory for raising pups." The suggestion carried invitation, not for Kaya to rejoin her pack, but for the possibility of cooperative territory use, of the kind of loose alliance that allowed multiple packs to coexist in adjacent or overlapping ranges. It was unusual but not unprecedented, especially in harsh terrain where cooperation increased everyone's survival odds. "We might have pups by then," Kaya said, surprised to hear himself articulating the possibility. He and Ember hadn't made it yet. It was too soon, the relationship too new. But spring was months away, and the idea no longer felt like betrayal, but like appropriate continuation of life's patterns. His mother's tail wagged slightly. "I'd like to meet them, if you're willing." "I am." They stayed on the ridge until the pack below began their evening chorus, a collective howling that announced their presence to the wider landscape, that strengthened pack bonds through synchronized vocalization. Kaya and Ember added their voices, and for a few minutes 9 wolves sang together under the moon, their combined sound powerful enough to echo off distant cliff faces and carry for miles through the crystal-clear winter air. The next morning, the pack departed. Kaya and Ember saw them off, watching from the valley's edge as 7 shapes moved across the snow-covered landscape toward the eastern passes. His mother looked back once before disappearing over the ridge, and Kaya vocalized a farewell that she answered from the distance. Then they were gone, and the valley belonged once again to just 2 wolves. But it felt different now, less like exile and more like home, less like a refuge for grief and more like a foundation for whatever came next. That evening, Kaya and Ember made their way to the river together, taking the now familiar path to the viewing spot. Kaya no longer expected reflections, but the habit of twilight visits had become a comfortable ritual, a way of marking the day's transition from activity to rest. Ember had learned not to intrude on these moments, but to wait nearby, respecting whatever private communion Kaya was conducting with memory and water and the mysteries that lay between. Tonight, though, something was different. Kaya positioned himself at the bank and looked at the water, not lowering his head to the specific viewing angle, but just gazing at the surface in the general way one might watch a fire or the stars. The light was perfect. That golden hour when the sun hung just above the horizon, painting everything in warm tones that made the snow glow and turned the water to molten amber. And there, not in reflection this time, but in the water itself, he saw something that made his breath catch. Fish. Thousands of them, moving upstream in a massive spawning run, their bodies creating visible disturbances in the current, their collective movement suggesting irresistible biological imperative. Cutthroat trout, their sides marked with the distinctive red slash that gave them their name, fighting their way upstream to the spawning grounds where they'd lay eggs and begin the next generation's cycle. Easy prey, abundant food, the kind of resource concentration that could sustain wolves through the remainder of winter and into spring. But more than that, a sign. Not mystical or supernatural, but simply a reminder that life continued its patterns, that death and loss were balanced by renewal and continuation, that the cycle moved forward regardless of individual grief or resistance. Kaya looked at the fish, then at Ember, then back at the water. And in that moment, he understood that the reflections had served their purpose. They'd helped him survive the worst of his grief, had kept him alive when isolation and despair had nearly killed him, had guided him toward food and shelter and ultimately toward Ember's life-saving intervention. But they'd also released him. Had shown him, in that final manifestation, that his life wasn't meant to be frozen in memorial, but to continue, to build, to create new connections while honoring old ones. He'd asked the universe why Tala had been taken, why the trap had been there, why loss had to be so specific and so cruel. And the universe, in its way, had answered. Because that's how it works. Life and death exist in constant exchange, and meaning comes not from preventing loss, but from what you build in response to it. Kaya moved into the shallows and caught 3 trout in quick succession, his hunting reflexes sharp from the pack hunts, his body fully recovered from the grief starvation that had nearly killed him. He cached 2 and carried 1 to Ember, offering it to her in the sharing behavior that reinforced pair bonds. She accepted it with obvious pleasure, and they ate together on the riverbank as darkness fell and the first stars emerged in the clear mountain sky. That night, they denned together in the sheltered overhang that had become their primary sleeping site. For the first time since they'd begun sharing territory, Kaya initiated the kind of grooming and physical closeness that suggested not just cooperative survival, but genuine affection. The possibility of a bond that might eventually approach what he lost, even if it would never replicate it. Ember responded with obvious joy, her tail wagging, her entire body vibrating with the pleasure of acceptance and connection. They groomed each other until their coats gleamed in the moonlight filtering through the overhangs, until their scents were thoroughly mixed, until an observer would have identified them without question as a bonded pair. Later, as Ember slept pressed against his side, Kaya lay awake and looked at the stars visible through the den opening. Somewhere out there, his mother's pack was settling into their own night routine, moving toward new territory and whatever challenges awaited. Somewhere far behind them, on a ridge that felt both close and infinitely distant, Talus' grave held her physical remains, slowly being reclaimed by the earth that had formed her. And here, in this moment, Kaya existed in the present, warm, fed, connected to another living creature, carrying his memories but no longer imprisoned by them. The howl that emerged from his throat was different from all the others, not grief, not loss, not even quite joy, but something that contained all of those and transcended them, the sound of a wolf who had been broken and had discovered that broken things could be rebuilt into new configurations, that survival was possible after the unimaginable, that life insisted on continuing, and sometimes that insistence was itself a kind of grace. Ember stirred in her sleep, and her own voice joined his in a spontaneous duet, 2 wolves announcing their presence to the night, declaring their claim not just to territory, but to the future, to the possibility that spring would come, and with it new life, new chances, new stories to add to the ones that had already been written in snow and stone and the clear water of mountain rivers. The howl carried for miles, bouncing off cliffs, threading through valleys, reaching ears that heard and understood, or heard and ignored according to their own concerns. But whether anyone listened or not didn't matter. The howl was for Kaya and Ember themselves, for the simple fact of their existence, for the stubbornness of life in the face of death, for the mysterious gift of reflection that had appeared when needed and departed when its work was done. When the howl finally faded, silence returned, but it was different from the silence that had followed Talus' death, not empty, but full, not ending, but transitioning, not loss, but change. Kaya curled tighter around Ember and closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, his dreams were not of graves and traps and frozen reflections, but of spring grass and running prey and small pups tumbling outside a den, learning the world under the patient watch of parents who knew both the cost of survival and its value. The river continued its endless flow below the valley, carrying snowmelt toward distant oceans, reflecting moon and stars and the occasional passing cloud. If Talus's reflection still appeared in its surface at certain angles and certain times, Kaya would never know. He'd stopped looking. Because the living needed to attend to the living, and memory, that most precious form of continued presence, didn't require reflections to endure. It lived in the way he moved through territory she'd helped establish, in the hunting strategies they developed together, in the patterns of behavior and thought that her partnership had shaped. She was gone, but she was also permanent, woven into who he'd become, into the choices he made, into the wisdom he carried forward into whatever time remained. And that was enough, more than enough, everything. Winter continued its work, building snow depth, testing survival, culling the weak and unlucky from populations that would emerge in spring, reduced but resilient. Kaya and Ember weathered it together, their partnership strengthening with each successful hunt, each shared meal, each night spent in the warmth of combined body heat. When spring finally arrived, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence, the valley transformed. Snow melted into rushing streams, grass emerged green and urgent from ground that had been frozen for months. Prey animals grew fat on new growth, and predators grew fat on prey animals, and the whole interconnected system pulsed with renewed energy. And in a den beneath an overhang where two wolves had weathered their first winter together, small voices began to sound. The mewling cries of pups encountering the world for the first time, beginning their own journeys through the cycles of growth and loss and adaptation that defined all lives in the wild. Kaya stood at the den entrance and looked out over the valley that had saved him, had sheltered him, had witnessed his transformation from grief-shattered survivor to something approaching whole. Ember moved beside him, tired from whelping but radiating the fierce protectiveness that characterized new mothers. Together, they watched the sunset over mountains that had seemed impossibly harsh just months ago, but now felt like home. And if a reflection appeared in the distant river, catching the light in ways that suggested familiar forms, Kaya didn't notice. He was busy with the present, with the living, with the future that insisted on arriving whether you were ready or not. And that was exactly how it should be.